Nice. So we're waiting on Kayla, Natalia, Denise, Isis, Kaylin, and Kai. Just give y'all a few more minutes. I just want to be able to see people's faces, and it's just a much more intimate experience, which we're missing from the classroom.
And if you think about what we covered last week in regards to the call and response, right? This helps with the process of call and response.
That's it. That's it. Absolutely. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start. Well, yeah, like I said, thank you for having me. I'm a historian at UCLA. I'm currently finishing up the dissertation. I'm also teaching a class on race making in the Caribbean, which is really interesting because we live in an age where political science and political information is spread through social media. Like people don't read anymore. And because of that phenomenon, people get very watered down versions of historical processes, of theory, of different things like that. So everybody is kind of just looking for the simple and quickest, easiest way to obtain a slogan. And so I'm here to disrupt that. So the first thing I want to ask y'all, and Professor Manzili sent me the syllabus last week, and I was so excited about it because it's so expansive. Because when we think of oral tradition, period, not just African oral tradition, but just oral tradition, period, we think, it has to come through word of mouth. Like that's our immediate response to it. But what the syllabus has done is expanded that notion to also include textual traditions, oratory traditions. And in essence, what that's argued is that, and what's emphatically African about that, is that this information of storytelling can travel through any medium. But what the enduring thread is that it's a fugitive language. And I'll get into more of that later. So what I want to ask y'all before we get started is what are some takeaways from the class? What have y'all taken away so far? What kinds of arguments have you all been introduced to? What's resonated? And there are some ridiculous answers, but most of them should be good. So feel free to chime in at once. I'm curious to see people are at with this because it's such a broad study. It's a broad and wondrous study, and really it's infinite. There's really no beginning and end to its lineage. It's cyclical. It's all of the things that disturb Western ideas of movements. So what are we thinking? How do we feel about the first? How many weeks of class have y'all had so far?
12 or 13. So this is
Oh, okay.
last, yeah, we to the end. So they had the
Oh,
whole
okay. Yeah, y'all been here for a minute. Yeah, so in 12 weeks, like what struck you? What are y'all feeling,
Um, for me at least, we've covered a lot of stuff overall. Personally, my favorite was towards the beginning where we were really learning about the origins of the African people and like where like African storytelling and oral history comes from. I really enjoyed that.
Mhm.
And then over the past few weeks, we've been learning and reading a lot of material from MLK and Malcolm X, which I really like learning about. So overall, like everything has been like really interesting, and I really enjoyed this class overall.
Oh, nice, nice. I had no doubt, of course. Anybody else want to chime in? What do y'all think? What are some things that have changed your way of thinking? So, what do you understand now that you didn't understand prior to enrolling in this course?
Well, something that I used to do prior, I used to read only literature that was written by a white male or a white woman. Now I expanded my literature into authors that are black, and like it has a different perspective on everything we've been reading, and like comparing it to what I used to read compared to what I read now. It's like a wide opening experience because like I didn't know that like what was going on literary wise is something that like I know now, and I could talk about it with others and let them know that there's more literature out there than just white male and a white female.
I see. I see. So it's changed your idea of like the literary canon, like what's important in literature. I see. Okay, that's important. What about this idea of griot, African-centered or African diasporic, a culture of griot, of storytelling that has spread? How did that strike you all? Was that surprising? Do you recognize that figure within your own culture, or within your own family? Do you have a family member that perhaps serves as a storyteller and a keeper of family memories and stories?
Um, for that at least, I found it like really interesting because typically in like Mexican culture, like older family members, they're the ones to like pass on like folk tales and to like give advice overall. So like for younger generations, we usually go to our elders. So it's either our uncles, aunts, grandparents if we still have them, or even like older sisters or siblings, whatever. So I found like the comparison like really unique because like griots, like I never really heard the term before this course. So like learning about it and really like doing research about it overall was like really eye-opening, and it was like really beautiful to really learn and like discuss with my classmates.
Okay, excellent, excellent, excellent. So you witnessed a direct connection, basically. Interesting. Anybody else? Kaylin, Natalia, Nakai,
I
Zara?
agree with Yeah, I agree with Angelica. Because I think that throughout the time that I've been in this course, I realized similarities, I believe, between my culture and the African American culture as well. For example, with storytelling, because in my family it was mostly like, well, my grandma, she would tell my mom and her kids all the stories, and then my mom would tell us. So it's something that's been passed down, from generation to generation. And I think I know it's not just my family. Like, I know it's within our culture. I know that we all like to share stories and we pass them down to one another.
Right, right. And so my final question is this, which is good, which gets into a point that I'm going to make a little bit later on. So we know this isn't just passing, like there's a folklore element of it, right? There is the pleasurable, cultural element of it. But what's the importance in this practice specifically for non-European cultures? Why do we need people to hold these stories for us?
It's really just to preserve cultures, stories, advice from like generation to generation. So like kind of like tips, and but really it's just like to preserve like everything that our culture has grown into and not let it be like in a way colonized again.
Right. I mean, it's not in a way, because you're exactly right. To demand a preservation of something means that something is attacking it, right? And even though I said cultures outside of Europe, this has even been the case within Europe. So ultimately, cultures that have been attacked by systems of imperialism or capitalism are at risk of losing their historical stories, their historical tales, et cetera, et cetera. And that ranges from Senegal to Colombia to Ireland, right? All these places have been colonized. So yeah, okay. So if we can just go back to this course, right? The expanded conception of oral tradition is what I found made this class so brilliant. Like, you're introduced to textual examples and oration that, especially Dr. King and Malcolm X were like heavy hitters of that, right? Because what oral tradition then becomes, it's still information passed down through generations by word of mouth. But what makes it, like I said, what makes it emphatically African is that in the modern era, especially, it's a whole fugitive culture. And when I say fugitive, it's in a celebratory light, because for fugitivity within this context means a diversion from Western logic. from oftentimes very violent Western logics of criminality, of colonialism, of white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. So in essence, these oral traditions today are like the progenitors of fugitive culture. So as we think of African oral tradition in this way, we can understand the brilliance of its many successors, right? So what are, and this is a rhetorical question that, what are things that have come from, traditional African stories that are kind of, um, produced by African or African diasporic peoples or Black peoples, and that kind of only speak to African peoples and African diasporic peoples. Even as they've appeared in the public stage, even as they've appeared on the radio, as they've appeared on television, they still only speak, it's like a secret language. They still only speak to specifically that population. So we have the evolution of linguistics, right? I don't know if anybody's from the Caribbean here or West Africa, but we have these dialects, and a lot of linguistics will call, I don't like to call them dialects, but for the sake of understanding, they're full-on languages, and they're like Pidgin English in Nigeria, which is a mix of Igbo, Yoruba, and like British slang that Nigerian people have formulated to talk to each other. We have patois, right? We have Creole. We have Ebonics in the US. We have Gullah. Do y'all remember that old Rihanna song, Work? Y'all remember that song? Right.
Yeah.
We say, right. So in that song, she uses a lot of what's called either Barbadian Creole or Bajan, which is a whole nother language. It's not a dialect. It's a whole nother language. And she said, me say you have to work. So like when that song came out, there were so many critics in the popular music industry that were like, what is she saying? Like, we can't understand this. And the beauty about it is that Rihanna, as you know, and Rihanna goes either way sometimes, but she's kind of vehemently anti-colonial in so many ways, right? Rihanna used that song to only speak to people who understood it, right? So in essence, she used that Bayesian as a marker of fugitivity in that song. She said, I don't care who understands it, it's not for you to understand. And then we also have traditions like jazz and blues. And while these musical traditions might seem global, right? These don't seem like fugitive traditions. In a sense, Miles used to play with his back turned towards the audience, right? There was a special language that was being translated through these performances that made it emphatically African storytelling through music. And you can really only understand if you are part of that struggle, that part of that population. As widely known as Miles Davis is, he's probably the most like popular jazz musician, even in white people's houses. So it's really just for a specific set of ears and eyes. It's fugitive art, right? So then African oral tradition has become a practice of freedom. Expression and storytelling thus becomes, it's unbridled, it's unbound. And like I said earlier, it's infinite. It can transform and kind of permute in all these different ways. So then when we talk about poetry, which is kind of what I chose to focus this lecture on, because, poetry kind of gets like a weakened rap, only because it's not seen or understood as like a militant form of literature. It's not understood as dangerous. And on the contrary, all throughout the 19th and 20th century, it was probably one of the most dangerous forms of expression throughout the African diaspora. You have African freedom fighters, people like Thomas Sankara, who was a freedom fighter in Eastern Africa, who was also a poet, right? And so many others. I could really just list, it would take me all day to list who all was a poet, but with a machete in their hand at the same time. The two did not cancel each other out. And this was because poetry did and still does gave people that unbridled permission to imagine a world vastly different than the context in which they were experiencing. And so not just that, but also, literature in the 19th century and 20th, and for at least the first half of the 20th century, literature and poetry, like people were reading then. I know now everybody's about social media. People aren't really reading. It's either on Instagram or it's not news, or Twitter. But back then, poetry and literature were the primary forms of what's the word I'm looking for? Propaganda. And this is good propaganda and bad propaganda. So writing something was in fact a dangerous act if it got in the right hands, right? And of course, when I say dangerous, it's also in a celebratory way, because again, these are all folks around the world that are pushing back against violent systems of oppression. We could really take any land and use that as an example. So yeah, so African/Black poetry then becomes an oral tradition, right? It's more than performance or textual or a speech. It's a practice of fugitivity and freedom, in which, or in a language in which only the storyteller chooses who gets to understand it. So real quick, I'm trained in history, and back to like just to circle back around to the importance of African oral traditions over time. It's been intrinsic to historians, at least radical historians that want to document the full story, that are interested in writing histories not about white people, not about Europeans, not about colonialism from the top down, but from the bottom up. And so one of our methods is to conduct oral interviews of their lineage centuries later, and the people, and also the people that now inhabit that geographical space, because both will have oral histories to share about whatever time period you're looking at. So for example, I do work on the late 18th century in St. Vincent, which is a small island right next to Barbados, kind of north of South America. And I do research on people called the Black Caribs, who were a Black and indigenous group that were there, that fought off the British and French, that fought off British and French colonialism and encroachment for about 2 centuries. These motherfuckers were bad as fuck, like. And so who they are today are a population called the Garifuna. And the Garifuna have preserved oral traditions so well that they're able, centuries later, right? I'm talking from 1792 to 2000, what year are we in? 2021, preserve stories from 1792. They're able to tell you what happened, right? And so just to give you all an idea of the documentation that normally we have to work with without oral tradition. Let me pull it up. I think I should, can I share? Professor Manzili, can you give me the share screen option? Thank you. Cool. Excelente. All right. So, so this is a, can y'all see? Okay, let's make this smaller. What are we doing? So this is an example of what historians have to go by because colonialism made it, in fact, that documentation from the mouths of Black or indigenous people throughout the world did not make it to the written stage and were not preserved. And so this document is from 1792, 10th day of April, 1792. And these are meeting notes, right, of the colonial government in St. Vincent. These are all British colonists, right? This is what I'm reading every day. I hate it, but it's necessary. But just to give you an example, so let me give you a real population breakdown. St. Vincent at the time had 80% African people. 20% of those were Maroons, which meant they were fugitive Africans that lived in the mountains of St. Vincent. They were autonomous, they were not enslaved. 50% were enslaved. And then the following percentage kind of just lived in and out of the settlements, right? They were just free. They were considered free Black men, free Black women, free Negroes, free, yeah. So they represented the majority of the population on the island, right? So if I'm writing a history on St. Vincent in the 18th century, you would think that in the meeting notes, Black people would appear, African people would appear, indigenous people would appear. And of course, that's not the case. So let's just go down, or they appear in very specific terms, right? So we have here the minutes of the last meeting were read and approved. An application from a number of respectable planters and merchants of this island to His Excellency the Governor and the Honorable the members of the council having been laid before the board, stating the great scarcity of all kinds of American lumber, for the want of which many useful buildings were obliged to be delayed. I know this is very like run on, but that's kind of how the British talked in the 18th century. And the planters were apprehensive of suffering greatly for the want of slaves to be made to make hogsheads as well as boards for heading, and praying for the admission of all kinds of American lumber for such a time, yada, yada, yada. And in this whole document, I think in this document, there's about 33 pages of meeting notes, yeah. African people only appear sporadically as enslaved people, right? And so that gives you an idea of the urgency of using, or the urgency of this tradition, the urgency and the meaningfulness of this tradition, because now I, as a historian, can go to, remember I said the Black Caribs today are known as the Garifuna, those are their direct lineage, and they live all up and through the Caribbean and Central America. So they live on the coast of, let's say Belize. I can go to Belize and talk to an elder, and that elder would be like, in 1792, so-and-so happened, right? And it's magical, it's wonderful, it's an incredible resource and historical method. So then what we see is African oral traditions become one of our most important archival methods. It becomes the archive of stories passed down by word of mouth. And that's not the only way we get to, you know, African and indigenous stories, but that's a fundamental way we do, you know? So yeah, I wanted to make that point about the criticalness of it, or else we would all be reading histories that claim non-white people in the world did not exist, when in fact, non-European people, or depending on the colony, built much of that infrastructure in the, you know, from the 16th century up. So not only did they exist, but they made it possible for there to be a meeting, period. They built the building. So yeah, so we could switch gears for a second and return back to poetry, as we should always do. And I wanted to talk to y'all, has anybody heard of a movement called Surrealism? Yeah. No, kind of. So Surrealism was a movement. It was a literary movement in the first half of the 20th century. Technically, it was started by white French writers, but then there became, from there emerged a group of Black Surrealists that took hold of the African diaspora, especially the Francophone African diaspora, which means the French-speaking African diaspora, which means all the colonies and lands that the French colonized. So in the Caribbean, that's like Martinique, you know, Haiti. In West Africa, it's like Senegal and stuff like that. So this PowerPoint isn't really important. I'm not a big PowerPoint person. But Surrealism, let me just see if it shows up well. Play from start. Oh no, that didn't work. Give me a second, y'all. The reason why I'm bringing up Surrealism is because I want y'all to know, like, even though this is a class, it's very much a history class, but I noticed at the end that y'all are also talking about contemporary figures too. But I want y'all to know how operational these ideas are, like how useful they are for you today. So this is exactly what the Surrealists figured out. Let's see, let me try to share the screen. Desktop 2. Excellent, okay. Play. Give me a second, y'all. I'm a little analog girl in a digital world. Let's see how this works. Review, I'm slow. Presenter view. There we go, kinda. African Surrealist. Nope, it didn't work. Okay, it's okay. So, give me a second. So yeah, surrealism was a movement that came about in the interwar period in 1929 specifically, and it came about like it was inspired by, you know, historians will write that it was inspired by European movements like the Dada art movement and stuff like that. But what people have found was that Andre Breton, who was the main cat that started it, was directly inspired by African influence in Paris at the time. And this is 1929. So do I have any history majors in here? History buffs? No, not really. Okay, so during the interwar period in the States and in the Caribbean, it was just much more attractive to go to Paris as a Black person. So at the same time, while we had a Harlem Renaissance, right, in New York, it was still volatile. It was still dangerous for folks to be in New York. And I think I saw your professor write down James Baldwin. So you know that James actually had a house. He made his home in the south of France because he found it to be much more conducive to his freedom. It was less violent for him in France at this time. It was a special time. So in France, specifically Paris, you had all these Black performers from all around the diaspora, from the Caribbean, from the States, from Africa, that would go there to study, that would go there to play music, that would go there to write, think, organize, et cetera, et cetera. So Andre Breton, the cat who started Surrealism, the white French cat, used to frequent all these jazz clubs in Paris. And in his notebook, he would write that the rhythm of jazz that didn't follow any metrics, right? That if y'all are familiar with a musician named Thelonious Monk, like he was known for like doing away with like classical, any type of like jazz metrics, paperwork, like Western rhythmic ideas, logics, and he would just play from the spirit, right? So Andre Breton was like, he took inspiration from that. He took inspiration from Afro-Caribbean thinkers that were in Paris, and he formed Surrealism. So in essence, it's kind of like an African foundational movement, if you really want to be specific, which was great because these were the kinds of Europeans that were responsible about it too. They were emphatically anti-colonial, anti-imperial. Many of them fought in anti-colonial wars in Africa and died for them. They were all pro-Africa. They were all communists. You know what I'm saying? These weren't the type of cats that would take, you know, African culture and claim it as their own. They knew what the objective was, at least globally at the time, right? And so before the formation of the movement, which technically started in 1929, you had all these African influencers of Surrealism. And again, this was the interwar period. This was the time of the Harlem Renaissance. Like Black thought, period, globally was pulsating in a world, especially in spaces where people were uncomfortable or unhappy about their conditions. And this is in Europe, this is in Africa, this is Caribbean, this is in Russia, this is in China as well, you know, literally the world. And it was a special time, right? And so Andre Breton sees this and he writes about Black American jazz in France and all the liberatory aspects of it. And then his colleagues and the people, the rest of the cats who start Surrealism, a Surrealism movement with him, they're also inspired by events like the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines, historical Black and white abolitionists of Atlantic slavery. And they were like emphatically like pro-African diaspora, right? So then from there on grew this version of Surrealism that was specifically for African descendant people in the diaspora. And the first person they charted as the first Black Surrealist was this cat named Etienne Leroux, who was a Martinician poet and philosophy student. And at the time, this was 1932. In 1932, from his small ass apartment on the Rue Tournon in Paris, Etienne Leroux damn near planned a revolution, right? So he was, remember I told you in Paris at this time, it was a safe space for Black people to go and study, right? Because in Martinique, I mean, Martinique still is a colony of France today, right? So that was really the only place where they can go and study and earn degrees. And we're not making the claim that, Western degrees are liberatory in any way. It's how you use them. But for that moment, that was a survival mechanism. That was a survival tool. So his name was Etienne Leroux. In 1932, he started a group, and he began by rallying 8 of his fellow scholarship students. And I'm going somewhere with this history of Black surrealism, because I want y'all to really understand that this class isn't just informational. I mean, it's wonderful if it is, but it's also, a call to action, so to speak. So he began by rallying 8 of his fellow scholarship students. Most of them were from Martinique as well. And they were all between 20 and 25 years old, into a group called Légitime Défense, which in French, it means self-defense. And they immediately started a journal with that name. So in 1932, like I said earlier, it's much different than 2021. To start a journal in 1932, that's their primary mode of propaganda, of production. Like, y'all want to do Facebook posts? They were like, no, we're starting a journal. Like, that's how they got their expression out, right? And this Légitime Défense journal was surrealist from cover to cover. So let's talk about like surrealism. Do y'all know what surrealism means? Like, take a stab at like what the general meaning of it could be, and we can see how it applies to this particular group. Professor Manzili.
I had from earlier when you were talking about Martinique and how it's still a colonial empire. But it's something in the water in Martinique, right? Because they're familiar with Glissant, who is from Martinique. But you could literally trace a lineage of just revolutionary activity just through Martinique by itself.
Yeah.
From Fanon, right, to Césaire. So, like, it's something with these cats from Martinique who really take up this idea of really challenging colonialism. And then, two, for me, when I'm thinking about the surreal poetry movement, like, you're tipping around what's really birthed through the origins or the axiomatic realities of what negritude is, right? Like, this is really building up into this movement that we call negritude, where African thinkers are partnering poetry with politics. And you have someone like Césaire, who is a poet who actually goes into political office, right? Now, his politics is questionable. Like, there's a critique that he did offered there. But I just, to me, there's something up with Martinique. And think about the way that Martinican thinkers are really pushing this revolutionary ideas forward is really, really something as far as the Caribbean apex of revolutionary activity.
Yeah, no, agree. And that's super useful, that genealogy you just gave. Thank you. And what I like to think, why I like to think that is because in the lands where people are most repressed, you have the most creativity and the most production. And C.L.R. James has a great quote. He says, the only place where African people did not revolt are in the pages of capitalist history books. And so you can kind of measure, to some degree, the degree of oppression on a land by how much revolutionary and radical, and this comes in the form of music, organizing, poetry, publication, how much is produced from that land. So yeah, Martinique definitely needs an insurrection, right?
Right.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned Césaire, because Césaire actually got his roots in Black surrealism. He was a Black surrealist as well. And negritude grew out of it. Negritude grew out of Black surrealists. I think, well, we could talk about that later. But so yeah, so this cat, Etienne Leroux, and I had pictures. I just don't want to pull up the PowerPoint, but y'all don't need pictures. It's okay. He planned a revolution. So yeah, so the journal that they put out under the name Légitime Défense it was said to be surrealist from cover to cover. Oh, I asked y'all earlier, like, what is surrealism to y'all? What do you think it means? Besides kind of like this abstract term that we hear in maybe European literature, what do y'all figure from it? I want to hear from folks. I don't know if y'all are awake. Nakai, sorry, I'm calling on y'all, putting y'all on the spot. Isahu.
They should be used to it though. Ain't nothing different from me. They know what's up.
Wake up.
You volunteer or get voluntold. It's okay.
Kayla, Isis, the almighty Isis. Come on.
Oh, one of my teachers called me that before.
Oh, okay. What do y'all think? What does surrealism sound like to you? Because it's important to how it was handled in the African diaspora.
When I was in high school, I took graphic design, and one of our projects was incorporating surrealism into our art piece. So how it was explained to us was that it was like a creative form of bringing in different elements into one piece. So whenever I think of surrealism, I think of incorporating like your creative thoughts and other elements that are present and that are like really talked about and making it into one thing. Like,
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I could see that. In like aesthetic and art form. Was surreal and surrealism translates into like a bizarre state, right? A bizarre state, a state that doesn't make sense. And with that description, because it's so open-ended, because it's kind of abstract, but in a good way, it gave people the permission to, again, and I use imagine as a militant word, right? It's not a Beatles imagine all the people. It's a militant word here. It's a militant concept. It gave people permission to imagine societies and ways of being and ways of relating to each other, even interracially, that were beyond what Western civilization considered logical or considered non-bizarre. So in essence, if somebody is like, write me a bizarre paper on Martin Luther King, you're gonna think of the wildest shit. Maybe not Dr. King, that's a little disrespectful, but like, on Los Angeles, you're gonna think of the wildest shit possible. It kind of, you see how it kind of unlocks all the potentials, right? With these words, this prompt of bizarre, of the marvelous, but the marvelous is a common term that's used within surrealist prompts and writings. And the reason why that kind of like unbridgedness is important is because you have to think about how long colonialism and how deeply entrenched it was in everybody's minds. So in essence, from the way that you speak to eat, the way you relate to your parents, the way you think about work, the way you think about production, about education, all of that stuff had to be challenged. And they did it by saying, think of the most bizarre world and write about that shit. Imagine it. And that's what we're gonna work towards.
If I can interject, I think too, like this becomes very generative. And think about who we're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. And think about the time that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So the reason why these individuals moved to Paris, right? Because they're literally being murdered in onslaught, right? Which is not too different from our present day reality, okay? But if you're talking about the bizarre, if you're talking about the beyond normal, right? Think about a people whose very existence is viewed as bizarre, right? Their very existence, their epidermis is
right.
what's normal, right? So think about how useful and how fecund the ability to imagine things beyond bizarre becomes for people who are oppressed or people who are othered to the point that their whole existence becomes a bizarre existence. So when you talk about being able to be imaginative, and you talk about being able to be creative, you're talking about being able to be liberatory, right? That's a triangulation that takes place within the African reality that it becomes really, really useful for being able to produce art, for being able to produce poetry, for being able to produce literature, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. Bizarre becomes a safe word.
Yeah.
It becomes a safe word. And it's exciting. It's exciting as fuck at the same time. So the legitimate defense, which is I keep going back to this journal because the response to it was wonderful. It gives you an idea of that's going to tie into the activity that I'm gonna have y'all do later on. But they said it was surrealist from cover to cover. It was bizarre from cover to cover, right? With strong far left Marxism influences, which is common. The Third World International was active of the day. A lot of Black Pan-Africanist thinkers were also communist and on different levels. And so legitimate defense was a whole new tone of a body of literature in Caribbean thought, Caribbean literature and thought. It was a whole new tone that was developing out of Martinique. And so it was 24 pages and it covered a large range of material. It was a mix of surrealist manifesto, poetry, revolutionary theory, and sharp criticism for the bourgeoisie and what they called its docile politics and complacent culture. And these critiques weren't just for the middle class and the bourgeoisie of European descent. They were for the bourgeoisie of the African descent as well, and everything in between. And so the journal was banned by authorities in Martinique immediately, almost immediately. And the group created a stir that was entirely out of proportion to its size. The journal's press run didn't exceed more than like 500 copies. It may have even been as small as 300, people say, but it was still called the most insurrectional document ever signed by people of color. And if I was a little bit better organized in my desktop, I would have loved to show you all some documentation from it that I found of the actual of a copy of the actual journal. But yeah, that's huge. It only had 300 copies, 300 to 500 copies, but it was deemed from much of the 20th century, from like the 1920s to the 1960s, the most insurrectionary document ever signed by people of color. And Etienne, and like this is a diasporic production as well, and a diasporic group from Martinique, because Etienne was also influenced by thinkers like Du Bois, you know, Claude McKay, Garvey, Langston Hughes, Catherine Dunham, Zora Neale Hurston, Sterling Brown, C.L.R. James. So these think tanks weren't isolated from the rest of the African diaspora. And again, this is also global. So there were Black surrealists in Germany. There were Black surrealists in China, in these places where we don't think that Black literature, Black literary production existed in the interwar period. So Leroux died, he ended up dying or transitioning in a French military hospital in 1939 because he ended up fighting in the war against Germany during World War II. So that was, you know, he's kind of credited as the father of Black surrealism. And I wish I had some poems for y'all, but maybe next time. I think what I'll do is find some and scan them and send them to your professor so you all can read them when you get the chance.
We did read your poems though. We didn't read. So if you want to go there, you could do that too.
Okay, for sure. So yeah, so you know, in conclusion, I bring up Black surrealism because poetry, therefore, is not what we simply recognize as the formal poem, but it's a revolt. It's they call it a scream in the night, an emancipation from old ways of thinking, and even an emancipation from language in and of itself. And so yeah, so I'm curious, and y'all have to be graceful with me because those are old poems. So yeah, let's pull them up and see what we could find with those guys. So yeah, y'all could pull up the poems that you that were assigned to you. Okay, let's see. I sent y'all 2 of them. Let me pull them up. So the first one I wrote in 2017. What was happening? I think because of the bit in the middle that references 66% of white women. Do y'all remember where that what number that came from, or what that's alluding to? That was during the first election when 66% of white women voted for Trump. So that kind of gives me an idea of like what the context was that made me write this. So yeah, so let's pull up that first one and go through it. What did y'all think? And you don't have to be, you know, PC or polite, or you don't have to get it.
And you can also work through your journal, right? So you should have a thesis for the poems. You should have a method for the poems. You should have an analysis of the poems. You should have a contemporary analysis of the poems. And then any questions that you had about the poems also. So you can work through your journals to engage these questions.
So it's called Switch Up. since this one is short, I'll go ahead and read it so it can refresh. It can refresh y'all. Sorry, y'all are over here looking at my thing. Okay. Protect your neck. There are savages roaming the wild that spend days imagining new chain ornaments for it. The finest rope, the shiniest debt. There are the uncivilized that will eat your children and call it market capitalism. Cannibals till the world blow. Some will prove themselves foreign once the sun hits. Their ideas will seep into neo-colonies, the middle class. Kin will outrank skin folk. You must fight amnesia, wrong until proven right. Protect your neck. Your jugular holds more weight than 66% of white women, simply because Layla Hathaway did that thing with that song nobody could believe. Watch yourself. Your innocent vacation to a complicated beach, your sacrifices, your language. I hear savages love language. So is anybody familiar with Layla Hathaway? I know you are, Amiri.
Yeah, you know, they young too, sis. You know what I'm saying?
Oh,
I be struggling with my references all the time. Like, damn, I'm too old to be jumping.
Yeah, we're old goats. Okay, for sure. So Layla Hathaway is y'all may not know who Donnie is. Donnie Hathaway's daughter, and she's a singer. And around the same time that the election results came out, I don't know if you remember this, Professor Manzili, but there was a video that was circulating of Layla doing like an impossible run of a song just from her throat, and it looked so effortless, and it was kind of creating this uproar, like, you know, she's amazing, like she's on track with like Ledisi and others in terms of like her pipes, like her ability to sing, and so that's kind of what that's referencing. If we have time later on today, I'd love to show y'all that clip of her singing because it's amazing. But what did y'all think of this? What do y'all think I was trying to do here? Would you consider this, from what we just talked about, would you consider this surrealist, Black surrealist poetry? What y'all think? Do you get it? Do you understand it? And it's called Switch Up, which should give you an idea of kind of the intention of method of how I try to write it.
I fuck with the Wu-Tang reference though. I did like that. I don't know if anybody else caught that, but I thought that was dope.
Yes. No, what do y'all have in your journals? I'm curious. And again, no answer is ridiculous. Okay.
Well, for me, in the beginning, like when it says there are savages roaming the wild that spend days imagining new chain ornaments for it, I kind of feel, and I might be wrong, but I feel like you were talking about maybe like, well, you know, not everyone, but maybe like white supremacists or individuals of the white community who are thinking of ways, I guess, to, I don't know what the word is, but kind of like to incriminate, I guess, maybe like the African community. I feel like I said, I don't know if I'm wrong, but that's kind of what like I thought about when I read that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, and it's on the right track. So what happened with me is, so I'm a colonial historian, which means that I'm used to these terms of racialization that the British and French and Spanish use to further their logics of market capitalism and colonialism and land acquisition. So things like savages, calling people savages, or Negroes as slaves, or cannibals, that's very frequent. And so in my head, I was thinking like, the irony, sorry, this background. The irony of all of this at this time, specifically in the 18th century, is that when white planters were calling indigenous people African enslaved people savages, or indigenous people cannibals, they were in fact enacting those practices themselves, right? And so in my head, I was like, let me write a poem where that's brought to light, where I'm using these terms switched over to reference the planter class of the day, whoever the white planter class of the day is. So protect your neck. There are savages roaming the wild that spend days imagining chain ornaments for it, right? And that's an illusion of nooses, right? The finest rope, the shiniest debt, right? Chain ornaments. When you buy expensive chains, you're kind of in debt. Also, like the quote unquote third world has been ravaged by debt, not ravaged, but imposed with debt after as a condition of like post independence. So you have all these countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean that are like $30 trillion in debt only because the colonial power said so. And so they're spending the rest of their days to today working off to pay an imagined debt. And it's supposedly a shiniest debt because what this debt does is give people the illusion that they're closer to the Western world. And that's what makes it shiny, right? And then it says there are the uncivilized that will eat your children and call it market capitalism. And that's a direct reference to the irony of calling a people uncivilized when you in fact have been the most uncivilized social group of people. And again, I'm not one to attribute it to a specific nation, because nation is a fairly new concept, but a social group of people, capitalists, right? Market capitalists, imperialists, people with these objectives, excuse me, that will eat your children and call it market capitalism. And it just makes me think real quick. Cedric Robinson, who was a political scientist, brilliant historian, passed away maybe about four years ago. He has a really good quote that says, "Western civilization is neither," and it's hilarious because it's neither Western, because for it to be Western, that means we'd have to be looking at the map in a very Eurocentric kind of way. And it's neither so it's neither Western because it could be Eastern or it could be Southern, depending on your vantage point. And it's not a civilization because there's been no point in time when the social and economic practice has been civil in a quote unquote Western civilization. So he says Western civilization is neither. But that just reminded me of that quote. So moving on, I say some will prove themselves foreign once the sun hits, which is interesting because a lot of the time, planters from Britain, a lot of indentured workers, a lot of indebted people, Englishmen would move to the Caribbean to try to, erect plantations and get in on the profit, and they would become sick. They would become sick from malaria, from yellow fever, from the sun. You know what I'm saying? Like the climate literally did not agree with their biology. And so they were foreigners. And that's yet another contradiction. It's another irony that you're foreign in a country, in an island that you've colonized and that you claim is your own territory, your own nation. So their ideas will seep into neo-colonies. The middle class / the middle class, kin will outrank skin folk. You must fight amnesia, wrong until proven right. Protect your neck. Your jugular holds more weight than 66% of white women, simply because Layla had, and that's a reference to, the the vast talent of African people, and oftentimes a distraction of white votes or votes in general. So watch yourself, your innocent vacation to a complicated beach. And that's a nod to, this new culture of people considering travel to different lands as kind of like a liberatory, neutral experience, when in fact your presence on other lands always means that there's some sort of dispossession taking place. Your presence at an Airbnb in Jamaica means that someone had to get kicked out of that neighborhood, and they're most likely living in, in destitute, right? No matter ethnically or lineage wise where you're from. So people have kind of lost that self-awareness, especially in the Western world. So your innocent vacation to a complicated beach, your sacrifices, your language. I hear savages love language. And that last line I put down because, this whole poem is a play on language. It's on flipping language to the other understanding. It's about exposing the irony of how these terms have been wielded and how these ideas have been wielded. Does that make sense?
Professor Griffin, can I want to pose a question to class because you have this line and it says you must fight amnesia, and for me, I don't know about the rest of the class, but glissant popped into my mind, right? And the class, since you should know this, right? Think about the phases of the abyss that Glissant kind of articulates in the Open Boat Poetic, right? So how would you guys be able to draw a connection between that line and then the work that you read from Glissant as he kind of articulates the three phases of the abyss? Can you guys find or locate that connection? I know it's a little bit further back in the semester, but we dealt with this in the midterm, the three phases of the abyss, right? We know the first is the boat. The second abyss is really the one that this is making me think about. Actually, I'm sorry, the third abyss, because the second abyss is arriving to the new land, right? But that third abyss is everything that you leave behind. So how does this fit into this idea of fighting amnesia?
Um, I would say like right here it says you must fight amnesia, which is pretty much trying to keep your culture. So like in the abyss, it's like the process of getting stripped from your culture, from everything that you know, including your language, your culture, your religion, and everything, and being uh, given like a whole new identity and being forced pretty much to do it. So in the poem, it's saying you must fight amnesia. So you can't forget your culture, you can't forget where you came from. So like the practice of oral history protects it.
Cool. And I'm looking at the chat. Isis, you had a comment. Do you want to kind of articulate that out loud? Because it's a very good point.
So like amnesia, I believe it makes you forget. And to fight amnesia, like you're fighting to keep your memories and keep your culture within you and not let it be stripped away from you. Kind of like what she was saying.
Yeah, definitely. So again, I just want to make sure that we're making these connections between the work that we're viewing and the work that we've already covered, right?
That's dope. What did y'all think of this first piece? Was it easy to understand? Was it a bit complicated? I know if this was complicated, I know the second piece was like, what is she talking about?
I personally really liked it. There's a lot of like a lot of the language like was simple, but in the way where there was a lot of hidden meaning behind each sentence and each stanza. So I thought that was like really cool. And the last sentence that you have here, I actually thought of it in a different way. So I hear savages love language. So I assumed that meant like usually in like history, colonists are always like, oh, I'm doing this to like like spread what's the word um development, I guess, and like civilized culture. So that's what they think, and that's their way of like, oh, I'm here, I might as well like civilize everyone else here, which isn't really the case. But when you explained it, it kind of made more sense.
I see.
I wanted to make a comment. I on the second, um, yeah, the second one where it said there are the uncivilized. They will eat your children and call it market capitalism. I kind of thought of that, in a way like how we've just become okay with this idea of like them taking over us, if that makes sense. Like I don't know if I'm making sense, but it's like how we've just become okay with other capitalism, and like we think that it's just the new normal.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that because what Black surrealism does is that it explodes normal and normality. And so what I did in these poems, I'm sure I did it in the second one, definitely in this first one, like I try to think beyond conventional ways of looking at terms, of concepts, of things as my form of bizarre, right? And so, oh dang, the time has went by fast because I wanted to do an activity with y'all. So would y'all rather do a quick activity or go through the second poem? What you think? I think I want to do the activity because I'm curious and I haven't heard from everybody. So I want to I wonder if we'll have time. Let's see. Give me a quick second. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is give you all maybe like 2 minutes. And here's the prompts. You might want to write this down. So think about the single largest injustice that you can identify. It can be affecting you directly. It can be a global injustice. Just what are you, what's grinding your gears at the moment, right? It could be COVID. It could be the state's response to COVID. It could be, somebody passed away and they didn't have to. And I want you to write a poem of 3 lines to address it, but I want it to be dangerous, which means write 3 lines that you think would get you caught up in like a public forum, that you think if you were in a court in the corporate world, write 3 lines about that injustice, responding to that injustice or describing it, that you think is so bizarre, is so out of the norm, is so offensive. And you can write anything. Feel free to curse, do whatever you want. Just 3 lines, y'all. And it doesn't have to be super poetic. Just be, the most important part of this exercise is to be serving shit in the morning, Caitlin said. What? It doesn't have to be poetic. It doesn't have to be, it has, the most important thing is for it to be unbridled, which means like be free with it. So respond to it. So I'm gonna ask everybody, and I think we'll have time if we stick to 2 minutes. What's the injustice that you thought of, and tell me the 3 lines. Okay, so we'll come back at 3:58. I'm gonna go ahead and stop my video. Okay, so we could kind of shuffle back in, and you don't have to explain it or qualify it or anything like that, but let's go down the line and just give us your injustice and give us those 3 lines. And these are examples of surrealist production, right? Give us the bizarreness of your mind. Go ahead. I'm not gonna call anybody's names, but like y'all could just, because we have about 2 minutes left, so y'all could just
I'll go first.
Okay, go ahead.
White government, white laws, inhumane, heartless, and unjust. You separated my family without giving a fuck.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'll go.
Okay.
I said, well, my topic is about immigrants in the U.S. You say that there are drug dealers and rapists that steal jobs, Yet you had a clear head start above all. Most of all, you're hypocritical because you did the same on the land you stole.
Mm-hmm.
Who's next? Who's next? Pamela, Ariana, Isis, the almighty Isis, Nakai. No?
Yeah, I'll go to fill in some space. We're fighting a global pandemic, mass shootings, maskless white folks coughing on produce, privilege, storming capitals, whiteness 19 is spreading.
Ooh. It's
Go
time.
ahead, go ahead Ishayu.
I wrote, "What's the point of working your ass off? Does the phrase earn your spot mean anything anymore? I guess it's teaches money and power decides your destiny."
Capitalism critique. Can we get two more before we go?
Okay, let's get two more.
Yeah, I'll go. So, the largest injustice is homelessness. Too many people out there. So, that's the largest injustice.
Okay.
Got it. When you get some time, write some things to that. Write some unbridled, like free thoughts on it, on how ridiculous it is, especially in this city, to have all these empty buildings and a whole black colony of houseless people.
Let's get one more. Call it a day.
Okay.
I'll go.
Pamela. Oh, who was it?
Oh, that was me, Isis.
Oh, okay. Oh, Isis, please.
This is about Elijah McClain, I think his last name was.
Mm-hmm.
I put jogging and remaining harmless. How did you feel threatened from inside your home? Called the cops. Now Elijah never made it home.
Mm-hmm. Pamela, did you want to go too?
Yeah, well, so mine is on police brutality. And mine is, I can speak, but I have no voice. I can breathe, but there's no oxygen. I am a son, a daughter, a mother, a father. I am a human. Please hold your fire.
Nice. So with all of these, I would challenge y'all to think, and I know we're over time, I apologize, to think even beyond like writing an appeal. Think beyond appealing to these systems. Think what the world could be like even beyond those ideas. So I didn't talk about my second poem, but I don't know if you all are familiar with the holiday Juneteenth, right? It's a famous Black American holiday, and it signifies, for Black Americans, the moment that freedom, the news of freedom came, right, post Civil War. But to have freedom, to have the idea of freedom, you have to have an idea of enslavement. So in essence, the only way we can conceive of freedom is to have enslavement as a possibility. And so I was frustrated with the idea of celebrating a 19th century idea of freedom. And I was thinking about what's beyond freedom? What's beyond freedom? So yeah, language, play with that language, and it can be a powerful thing. It can be a very powerful thing. So yeah, thank y'all for having me. It's been wonderful. I hope I was useful. Professor Manzili, you have an excellent class. I enjoy talking to y'all, and I'm excited. I'm excited for your future weeks from your syllabus. I wish I could take this class.
Right. So again, sister, thank you, man. I definitely appreciate your time. It was generative for me. It was informative, insightful. So I appreciate it. You're a historian, man. Like you're a fundamental core historian. Super dope. So you guys reach out to me next week. We're presenting our presentations. You guys should have your songs ready. You should have those kind of ready to go. Again, how you do that is totally up to you. Kind of going back to what a subtle theme of this course was, of this lecture today, the imagination, right? So I'm excited to see how you guys engage your imagination as you represent your projects. If there's any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me, shoot me a text. If you do shoot me a text, though, please let me know what class you're from and your name, so that way I know who I'm talking to. I have 40 students, and y'all just shoot me with questions. I'm like, yo, I don't even know who the fuck this is. So just put a little title on that for me. Other than that, be healthy. It's a beautiful day. Get some sun, drink some water, try to exercise, stay well, and I will see you guys next Wednesday. Peace.
Professor, for the last 2 weeks, I was having a hard time with Zoom and connections. And I know the presentation, we have a presentation due Monday. I'm from group A.
Right?
Yeah. I have no idea who my group members are or like the guidelines, and I'm really scared to like fail this class. I did my my midterm pretty well and my journals, but I'm really scared that this is gonna like drop my grade.
So this is what we'll do, just because I don't think it would be fair to try to partner you with the group this late in the semester. You just gonna have to write a 5-page paper for me on anything you want. How does that sound?
Anything I want?
Anything you want. I mean, it has to do with the course, of course, right? But anything,
Yes.
anything that we covered in the course so far, just give me a 5-page double space. Make sure you double space the paper on anything you want. Just give it to me by the 21st. I think I have to have grades in by the 23rd. So if you get that to me by the 21st, you should be fine.
Okay, so instead of the presentation, I would do a 5-page paper based on something that I've like learned from the class.
Yep. Anything we've covered. So kind of go back through your journals, see what spoke to you the most and what was most impactful for you, and then try to produce a paper. One thing about papers, Isis, a good paper comes from a good question. A good question comes from a good problem. So for you, especially the last assignment we just got done doing, where you're thinking about the most egregious problem in society, that's going to be helpful because you want to have a question that really kind of deals